Right, well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. Actually, this lectern doesn't allow enough space for paper, the good old-fashioned way, so I'll dispense with that. Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you. What I'd like to talk about this morning is a report that is actually out today. And so we're very pleased to be able to premiere it here at the OASPA conference. It's a report, so given the URL there, I realise there's a danger I lose most of my audience by giving it first up in the presentation. But it's a report that has been put together by a consortium of partners for Universities UK, and it's looking in particular to establish some measurements around the uptake of open access in the UK within the context of the global research infrastructure. You can see here that the partners were Research Information Network, University of Sheffield, Research Consulting and Elsevier. An interesting contrast of styles. I'm not just talking about their logo design either. It was a very interesting experience actually doing this project. Now, I've only got 15 minutes, so what I'm going to give you is hopefully a flavour of the report and encourage you to look at it for yourself. The background to the report is that about a year ago, a working group was assembled in the UK consisting of policymakers, funders and so on, that came together to agree and recommend a group of measures that could be used for establishing the state of play with regards to open access in the UK. And potentially beyond as well. And they recommended these four major areas of indicators for open access to do with accessibility. That is the accessibility of open access, both in terms of total numbers and proportions of the literature. The availability of open access options to authors that were made available by publishers, the usage of open access materials, and financial sustainability for the various different stakeholders within the process. Now, essentially based on those measures, the UUK then agreed to fund a project which is awarded to the consortium I've mentioned to do a first trawl of that with regards to the UK. So we worked for the first 6 months of this year, aiming to establish a baseline for future measurements of open access within the UK. Now you can see here the different strands of the project, and that each of the strands was led by one of the partners. Important, though, to emphasise that all of the partners had an input into the design of each of the strands, and also into the interpretation of the results that came out. We were using a number of different data sources to do this work. Scopus was a key data source with Elsevier research on board. That was inevitable, but it was also one that we used not just for working out the global and UK figures on accessibility, but we also used it as a target at times for comparing with other data sources. So, for instance, article processing charge data we got from institutions, we fired at Scopus to see what it looked like in terms of, say, subject distribution. We did a lot of work on public websites, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along, as well as getting data from various stakeholders, from publishers, from repositories, from institutions themselves. We looked at publicly available financial returns for learned societies and also publicly available data sources such as DOAJ and Sherpa Romeo. That's just some of the sources, the main sources we used. There were others as well, and I'll mention some of those as we go along. Now, each of these major strands is a presentation in its own right. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of what we concluded, and hopefully give you a flavour of it, but I'm very happy to answer questions. Now, there should be, I think, 3 co-authors of this report in the audience. There's myself, there's Michael Jubb, who's the lead author, and Rob Johnson from Research Consulting, who is there. So hopefully between us we'll be able to try to address some of your questions. Before I talk about each of the strands, though, let me just tell you what the headline results of the report were. First of all, what we saw is a strong growth in the availability of OA options to authors. That is, their ability to publish in an OA form or to make their work available in an OA form. We also saw a strong growth of uptake in the UK of OA, particularly in relation to the hybrid option, and also depositing of articles on websites, repositories, and in other places on the web. We saw that increasingly article processing charges are a considerable proportion of the overall cost of journals that are being paid by institutions, academic institutions. We saw enormous variability as far as the economics of learned societies were concerned, but had to conclude it was too early to make a real assessment about the impact of open access on those learned societies' finances. So let me just talk about each of those briefly in turn. The report contains lots of tables, and I appreciate in a presentation when you hit somebody with a table, they take 15, 20 minutes to really understand. And we actually sat as a group and looked at tables like this for half an hour at a time to try and work out what was going on. But let me just briefly describe what I think is going on in this table. So you'll see that there is a comparison here between the potential options, that is, if options available to authors. This is not what they do at the moment. This is what options are available to them on a global scale, first of all, on the left, and for the UK on the right. But by for the UK, we mean those journals in which UK authors published during the period covered. So you can see that, for instance, gold OA options, both in terms of APC ones and non-APC ones, constituted about 17% of the proportion of journals globally in the Scopus database. Hybrid, 49%, and the rest subscription only, apart from a small percentage of delayed open access journals. In the UK, you can see the availability of options for gold is slightly lower than that, but hybrid quite a lot higher, 63%, with the remainder subscription and a smallish proportion still of delayed OA. So what this is telling us is that there is a growing, you can see the comparison between 2012 and 2014. Overall, there is a growing set of options available for authors in terms of OA publication. And that is true for UK authors more than globally in terms of the journals that they use, which I think is quite important. Interestingly, subscription journals over the period were a declining number of journals, both in terms of the real number and in terms of the proportion of the overall, which I think is quite interesting. Those words there are for the record because they just say what I think I've just said. We found that levels of article processing charges varied enormously in the sample of journals that we looked at in detail. Only a small minority of over £2,000, that's just over $3,000. Should have done a euros conversion, but I didn't, I'm afraid. Now, there doesn't seem to be a discernible pattern here, just wide variation, which is probably a sign of immaturity in the market. The majority of hybrid journals charge £1,000 to £2,000 as well, with only a minority charging less than £1,000 or more than £2,000. Significantly, though, we did see that there were additional charges, which in particular disciplines made a difference, that is, colour and page charges, which often added to the overall cost for institutions and authors. As far as depositing or posting of articles on websites and repositories were concerned, we found also that the rules for this were incredibly complex. And even when you've got the details of them, they're very difficult to interpret. They're sometimes difficult to even find on publisher websites. So there's a lot of manual checking going on here to get at this. We saw evidence that policies were being modified in relation to funder requirements. So there were different policies for different circumstances depending on the funder, for example. And generally, as you'd expect, policies were more permissive for preprints and then getting less permissive progressively as you go towards the version of record, the actual publisher-produced PDF or whatever other format it happened to be. 4/5 of journals allow posting of accepted author manuscripts on personal websites, although some impose embargoes. Although very often embargoes could be longer if that posting is in response to mandates, which is quite interesting. And also, we've noticed a restrictiveness associated with posting on institutional and subject repositories compared with, say, personal websites. All of that is actually reasonably new, I think, but it's definitely there. Now, one of the things that was important to us to do in this research was try to estimate the proportions, overall proportions of open access material as far as the scholarly communication corpus is concerned. A number of studies have tried to do this, and it's actually quite difficult to do because it involves looking at all of the different ways in which an article might be available, both in terms of gold publications as well as deposited versions in repositories and other places as well. Now, some studies before us have, we believe, overestimated the availability of open access material because they've taken all of the gold, they've calculated how much green there is, and just simply added those two figures together. Whereas actually, evidence suggests there is enormous overlap between those. Gold articles are often also deposited, and so therefore you have to deduplicate in your calculations. This is very difficult to do. And so inevitably, it's an estimate. What we see here, though, is how material is made open access progressively over time. So we did censuses at, say, 7 and 8 months to see what was available after 6 months and so on. And you can see here, globally, the estimates look like this. 19% of articles globally are available immediately on open access. This is from the period covered 2013 and 14. Rising to 34% after 24 months. Interesting, the UK is ahead on every one of these figures in terms of availability. So 22% immediately, rising to 43% after 24 months. Now, that's still a pretty high figure, to 43% after 24 months. But it's not as high as some previous studies, and that's just an explanation as to why. We think this is a reasonably cautious, but we hope accurate, estimate of the availability of OA materials. And we can talk a little bit about that if you've got questions. Okay, I'm conscious of the time here, so what I'm going to do is move swiftly through, not looking in detail at the publications, which are also rising, and also postings. We did an interesting subject analysis of deposits, for example. And interestingly, health and life sciences are higher in deposits as well as in gold OA. That's largely because of PubMed Central. The other interesting thing about posting, I'm not going to talk about it, I'm talking about it, aren't I? But the other interesting thing about postings is the extent to which file sharing sites like ResearchGate have really exploded and really dominate compared even to, say, institutional repositories. It really is noticeable how much stuff is there in those kinds of places. Okay. We then move on to usage. Now, this is really difficult to do, and the initial report by the working group said this is really difficult to do. And our investigation said this is really difficult to do because it is. Because you're looking at so many different places where usage can occur. An article can be on a publisher website, in a repository, or multiple repositories on the personal website of the author. How do you possibly measure the usage of that in all its different versions and all its different instances? Well, we looked at various different sources, and you can see some of the results here, but basically, we concluded this is very difficult to do and conclude there is an urgent need to try to get more standards-based measuring of usage here. The standard accounter ought to help us here, but it really was difficult to do. Okay, moving on to financial sustainability, we focused on two different stakeholder groups, universities and learned societies. I'm going to talk very briefly about each of those. We used data from universities, looking at a sample of 24 universities who gave us APC data, and their subscription data was available. And what we've seen is a massive rise in centrally managed APC payments, over 550% over 2 years in terms of centrally managed APC payments, with great variability in terms of pricing being paid. Pricing ranging from £0 to £4,536, in fact. £0 where it's a highly discounted payment, and there were quite a few zero payments because of the way deals are structured, and we recorded those at the amount the institution paid, so we get a real sense of what institutions are paying, right up to over £4,500. The mean was £1,500 or so pounds, which I think fits with what Salvatore said more or less in terms of the levels there. Hybrid journals were consistently and considerably more expensive than fully gold OA journals. But we did notice, and once again, this correlates with what Salvatore was saying, that there is a correlation between APC price and quality measured by citation rates. How you interpret that is another matter, but that correlation is there. And once again, we see a domination of health and life sciences in terms of take-up. These are the top 10 publishers in terms of APC pays. I don't have time to talk about them in detail, but you can see the variability across the publishers. There are 3 fully open access publishers there. Biomed Central, if you consider them to be a separate publisher, PLOS and Frontiers. Those are the top 10 publishers. This is what it looks like in terms of payments made by universities, subscriptions in green, APC payments in blue, and admin costs for APC payments in red. And you can see for at least some institutions now, APC payments are a considerable proportion of the overall total cost for journals that the institution is paying. And at the moment, those are additional costs because subscriptions are not declining. Whether there is an offsetting arrangement put in place in future is interesting, and I know the next speaker is going to be talking about that. Learning societies, in all of our project discussions, this was the last thing we discussed and ran out of time, and I've run out of time now. Simply to say, there's enormous variability here amongst what learning societies are doing in terms of publishing and in terms of how they're publishing and also in terms of the revenues they get from publishing. Some make a loss from their publishing activities, some make a considerable profit. It's too early to say, though, the impact of open access, and particularly these policy developments in the UK, which set in motion in 2012, are having on learning societies. But there is a need to look carefully and continue to monitor progress in this area. And I think I better finish there because that's all I've got time for. Those are the headlines and those are the acknowledgements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen.